presentation first, and then we have 3 speakers, but if others would like to speak, please submit your cards. Thank you.
And departing. So the blue planes are all currently in the air on arrival, and the green are departing out of SFO, and everything white is not SFO traffic. So that's San Jose, Oakland, or passing through are the white planes. But you can see here a typical sampling of the number of planes that are in the sky at any given time.
Where's Palo Alto on that?
Palo Alto is right in there under all those planes. So
I wasn't sure if you were at the airport or if you were at Palo Alto.
yeah, I'll actually zoom in.
It's Palo Alto.
And if I zoom in, you can really see the flights that come from the north making their turn. Yeah, that's Bodega West, and I'll show you a little bit of that in the PowerPoint. So you can see that happening in real time right now. Okay. So, with the committee's permission, I thought I'd just very briefly give a little bit of context on where we've been, and then update you on the report that was summarized in your staff report before getting to recommendations, so that we have a foundation for the thinking behind the recommendations. Starting with what's going on and why is this an issue, airplane noise is growing for our community, in part because air traffic is growing significantly. So in the last 5 years, all 3 of the major airports in our region have been growing significantly. In the last 5 years, SFO has grown by about 1/4. Oakland has grown by nearly 1/3, and San Jose has grown by 50%. That's just in the last 5 years. I'm going to go through the other 2 points on this slide in a moment, but before I do that, I just wanted to give you a slight amount of information about each one of those airports. So these are statistics from Oakland International, and you can see the growth both in terms of passenger counts and in terms of cargo. And I think it's helpful for us to remember that cargo as well as passenger flights are part of the dynamic here. We've also, yes, yes, operations is takeoffs, landings, all kinds of operations, which is going to be a different number, right, than passengers or cargo. So, right, and we might have some military as well, which would not be under cargo or passenger. It would be a different classification, depending on the airport. San Francisco International, the top, I apologize, the writing on these are small. The top chart is passengers, and the lower right is operations. And you can see the drop-off that you can see the steady growth that we've had since 9/11 and the projections of how that's expected to continue significantly. And these are the cargo charts for SFO, and you can see while the upper left is domestic, the lower right is international. And if you look at the projections on international, we're expecting a significant increase in flights there as well going forward. And then these are the San Jose statistics. And again, you can see the significant growth in recent years in terms of passengers as well as cargo, and the significant projections for cargo. So it's growing, and all 3 airports project significant additional growth, well beyond what we've seen in the last few years. So in addition to air traffic growing, technology is changing the way the FAA controls air traffic. And if you look at the chart, actually I'm going to try to use a laser pointer here. If you look at the chart that the FAA prepared, you can see in March of 2015 is when the next generation, or what FAA calls next gen, kicked in for SFO. Now, they're phasing it in nationwide, so not all airports are enjoying next-gen yet. But SFO did implement the first stages of it in March of 2015, and many of our residents have observed that it was spring of 2015 when they noticed a significant change in the impacts in their quality of life. What you'll also see on this chart are some future elements of next-gen will also be phasing in: time-based flow management, collaborative air traffic management, and separation management. So those are things that haven't happened yet for SFO, but are scheduled in the future, and may give us an opportunity for some improvements depending on how it's done. So something we want to be at the table for when they're done. And then the third factor to think about is that technology is changing how the airlines manage flights and routes. So if you think about nowadays when you get in your car, if you use a GPS or Waze, some other app like that, you plug in where you're going and the system will tell you the fastest route to take you there. And that route might take you through side streets and neighborhoods instead of main streets if the main streets are too crowded. Well, this is a gross oversimplification, but the airlines have a similar ability now where they are trying to figure out how to get from the airport they're departing from to the airport they're headed to, and they want to be on time, and they want to save fuel, and they also want to avoid turbulence. So they're going to map the most efficient route for them in terms of economy and customer service. And so they may not always travel from point A to point B along the same corridors. They might alter that depending on weather conditions that could drive turbulence or other factors. So I think sometimes we have a tendency to think the FAA is controlling all elements of everything that's happening. But it's a dance between the pieces of this that the FAA is controlling, the pieces of this that the airports are controlling, the pieces of this that the airlines are controlling. And so there are a lot of different stakeholders involved in the decisions that are impacting where the planes are going. So all things we need to be thinking about. The upshot of that, of course, is that there are a lot of planes over the Bay Area on any given day. This is 24 hours of traffic in the Bay Area. And the question some ask is, well, okay, so if it's bad everywhere, Palo Alto, what makes you so special? And I don't think we're arguing that we're special, but I do think we're arguing that we have some things to consider. And after reviewing the facts, it is clear to me as a newcomer to city staff in learning about this issue that airplane noise is a real issue in the city of Palo Alto. It is for many of our neighboring communities as well. But I want to just summarize why it's such a big deal in the city of Palo Alto. 53% of arrivals to SFO fly over or near Palo Alto, more than half of arrivals going into SFO. So if you look at this chart, you can see, or this diagram, you can see about 40% are coming in on what's called DIMED, which is coming in from the east. That's the blue line here, arriving from the east. So these are the majority of flights coming in from Denver, New York, Chicago, and they're all coming in through DIMED. So about 40% of San Francisco arrivals come in from the east. Everything else isn't. So we have what we call the surfer route, which comes in from the south, comes in over the Santa Cruz, Capitola area, over the mountains, and comes in. You can't see the orange because it's covered up by the green, but the orange continues up to where you see some writing here. What that says is Menlo, and this is the Menlo waypoint, which is where the traffic is directed to get to in order to figure out how to get into the airport from where it was coming from. And Menlo is right near Palo Alto. So as a result, everybody who's coming in from the south on the surfer route is going to be directed through the Menlo waypoint, and they're going to be coming pretty much over most of Palo Alto in the process, and that's 30% of SFO arrivals. Then we have 5% coming in on Oceanic from the west, and those are the pink lines you see here, and they line up. And then again, they come in pretty much right over Palo Alto on their way into the Menlo waypoint. Now you may say, well, 5%, that's not so bad. It's not a lot of flights. I was interested, however, to learn as I studied this that 30, maybe 40% of those flights are coming in between like 4:30 and 6:30 in the morning. going out again? Thank you. So we'll have to hand this around. They're going to try to reset the speakers, but in the meantime, we'll have to pass this around. So when you add these together, you get 53% of the flights coming in over Palo Alto. What is 53% of what? So to put that in context, we get about, on any given day, about 315 planes flying over or near Palo Alto in a day. So that's 242 arrivals coming in from Diamond on the east, 181 coming in over Surfer, 150 coming in over Bodega, of which over 100 of those are coming over Palo Alto, and then another 30 coming in over Oceanic. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude. It's well over 300 planes on a typical day flying over the city of Palo Alto. And what we're seeing is the SFO noise office keeps track of the responses or reports of noise that they get from around the Bay Area. And Palo Alto is home to more noise reporters for SFO than any other community in the Bay Area. You can see here the Surfer route clearly expressing itself in noise reports where the Santa Cruz Capitola area is being impacted and the Los Gatos area, and then Mountain View and Palo Alto. And you can also see where the Oceanic flights are coming in and driving noise reports there, as well as the bodegas turning. If you look over to the right side of this, you'll see the SFO noise office shows how many noise complaints are coming in from the communities that are members of the SFO roundtable, and then from communities that are not members of the SFO roundtable. And you will see Palo Alto is number one in the number of reporters. So we have Santa Cruz at 125. This was for the month of December. Los Gatos at 147, Los Altos 169, and Palo Alto at 213. And let me just be clear, this is not the number of complaints, this is the number of complainants. So this is not reports, this is discrete reporters. So it gives you some idea of who's been telling San Francisco that they're being impacted.
Can you get this data for multiple years?
Yes, the noise office produces reports, and we can gather that for you. Did you guys do a reset? Testing?
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
great.
Doctor.
Thank you. Okay. So, in addition to SFO, of course, we've got two other airports. The good news is San Jose Airport is usually not as great a problem for the city of Palo Alto. As you can see on these charts, the planes take off typically in San Jose Airport. They take off and they turn to the right, away from Palo Alto. They come out over the bay and try to take up as much of the bay as possible before they sort of corkscrew up and out. However,
Microphone, please, Tom.
If you could just explain that last slide.
these are all slides from other FAA presentations. So they were making a different point when they were presenting this.
But is that pre-next gen, post-next gen?
I don't even know. I bet some of our residents do, because they were
Yeah.
probably there when this was presented.
Okay.
But I was only using it to compare it to the next slide.
If somebody
rather
knows,
than,
maybe they can
yeah.
tell me.
But they're comparable. I mean, if you look at them, they're not that different, which I suspect was the point. But I wasn't there, so I don't want to speak for the FAA. But if you compare this to the next slide, you will see how the pattern changes. And about 15% of the time, due to weather conditions, San Jose departures have to fly on what they call the south flow departure, which sends them to the west rather than to the east. And you can see on these charts that that sends them over Mountain View and Palo Alto. They're trying to stay over the water to the extent that they can at the beginning of the takeoff. But you can see from the legend that when if they go over Palo Alto, they're going over Palo Alto at some of the lowest altitudes, between 2,000 and 4,000 feet. So it doesn't happen often, but when it does, this is in addition to what we're seeing on the SFO arrivals. So what are we doing about it all? We last presented to the council in June, and at that time, we were directed to take several actions. So in response to that, we reached out to neighboring communities to begin exploring conversations about how we can work together. We researched noise monitoring options, and the staff at the SFO noise office confirmed that they can provide temporary noise monitoring to the city of Palo Alto, and one of our recommendations to you tonight is that we think we should go ahead and pursue that. We sent letters to the FAA in July and November in anticipation of reports coming out from the FAA, the last of which was the Phase 2 update, which came out in late November, and we conducted an analysis of the FAA's findings in that, and I'd like to give you a summary of what those were, and I'll try to move through these quickly, but I think each one deserves a moment or two of time because they're all issues that the city has taken positions on and has talked about in the past. So the first position that the city expressed to the FAA was encouraging the FAA to find ways to reduce congestion at Menlo Waypoint. And as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, Menlo Waypoint is the point that is very close to the city of Palo Alto where all of the planes are getting to before they get routed into their final approach to SFO. So the FAA took a look at that, and in their response, they said, well, it's really not possible to reduce congestion at the Menlo Waypoint because if we move the traffic to the east or the north, we will run into San Jose airspace, and that would create an unsafe circumstance, so we cannot recommend that as a solution. We being the FAA. That was their response to Palo Alto's request. Another one of the positions we had suggested was what about relocating flights to the east? And to the east, if I can direct you back over to that Diamond arrival, here's another drawing of where Diamond comes in. And then Diamond heads out over the bay and picks up final approach into SFO. So that's Diamond as it comes in from the east is going to create congestion if all of the flights that are currently running through our airspace are routed over there. So the FAA responded, well, it's a problem because it's going to create too much congestion by adding everything that's coming up from the south over to the east. And also, it's not very safe to load that up because the Diamond arrivals have to sort of thread this needle between the San Jose airspace and the Oakland airspace. And so that doesn't allow the air traffic controllers much opportunity to do much vectoring. They've got to stay on a pretty narrow approach as they head in to the final approach for SFO. And so there isn't a lot of flexibility for vectoring there, and you'd have to do some vectoring to feed our flights in between their flights. You have to sort of wiggle things around to be able to stagger the flights. And so because vectoring would be too tight in between the two other airspaces and it would create too much congestion, the FAA could not endorse that suggestion. We also asked the planes to fly higher over Palo Alto. And the response that the FAA provided to that was an interesting response because it was a two-part response. They said they couldn't endorse that either because the planes have to come in at a certain descent grade, so the closer you get to the airport, the lower the plane has to be. And if the planes are 5,000 feet or higher over Palo Alto, they won't be low enough to get to final approach in a straight line, so they would have to vector around in order to get enough distance to come down to where they have to be on final approach. And that would send them into San Jose airspace, which would be an unsafe situation according to the FAA in the report. So they could not endorse that either. Now, what was interesting about that response is in another section of the report, the FAA also conceded that there is already an agreement in place between the SFO noise office and the Northern California TRACON to actually try to keep the flights at 5,000 feet under certain circumstances when coming over Palo Alto. And the FAA formally supports that when possible. So In one portion of the report, they say they support this whenever possible, and in another portion of the report, they say except that they can't do it. So one of our staff recommendations is to continue to advocate for adherence to that agreement, which is on the record, and we would encourage the FAA to continue to follow. The next position is fly over the bay more often. We really don't want to push this problem onto our neighbors. We don't want to make our noise problems other cities' noise problems. The best thing for everybody would be to put more planes over the bay. And the easiest way to do that would be on the Bodega route. Instead of taking the Bodega West, which turns in over Palo Alto, take Bodega East, which flies over the bay. And what I have here is, I think this is unlikely to improve, and I say I intentionally because this is my opinion as staff. If you read the FAA report, what they're saying is, that's a great idea. We agree that we should use Bodega East over the bay whenever we can. The problem with doing that more frequently is Bodega East shares a final approach with Diamond. So with 40% of the flights already coming in from Diamond, the FAA's ability to then thread additional flights in over Bodega East is fairly limited based on the traffic congestion coming in on Diamond. So they say they will do it whenever they can, but right now it's a 70-30 split. So they're currently doing it whenever they can, and it's only coming to pass 30% of the time. The other thing the FAA says in the report is that with the growing traffic at the airports, we expect congestion on Diamond to increase. So if they're doing as much as they can already, and it's 30% of the time, chances are that's going to be reduced to well under 30 as the congestion on Diamond continues. So not a lot of improvement on moving the flights over the water. Our next position was reduce vectoring when possible. And the FAA says this is feasible to a point. It's a little difficult because of the surrounding airspace, so there are some limitations on it. And we think it's something that we should continue to be at the table to try to encourage when possible, where possible. Another position was adjusting schedules and sequencing to try to reduce the impact on our community. And again, the FAA says this may be feasible. In fact, they specifically call out the Bodega West route, which is the one that flies over Palo Alto, as a place that might be a candidate for improved sequencing. So that is a place where they're willing to explore that in the future. You will recall from my first slide that showed the schedule for next gen that improvements in sequencing are still a few years out. So that's something that would be coming in the future with additional technology. The last position we've taken in the past was about metrics, and a request that the FAA take a look at using new and better metrics. The traditional noise impact metrics that the FAA uses are based on the way air traffic control and airport impacts were done in the times when radar controlled air traffic control in the area. Since next gen, we've seen a difference in the way communities are impacted. So our argument has been noise metrics should be considered in the context of how technology works today rather than how it used to work. The FAA's response to this was rather interesting because the FAA would be the appropriate federal agency to explore what kind of metrics it's using. However, technically, the way the recommendation came out of the roundtable, the select committee, was the select committee voted to recommend to the congressional delegation to direct the FAA to use new metrics. So in the final report from the FAA, their response was, well, since you recommended that the congressional delegation should tell us to do this, that's not our action, that's Congress's action. So that's their formal response in the report. one of the appendices in the report do show you that in the House version of the FAA reauthorization bill, there is language related to metrics. So Congress is looking at that in the House. In the Senate version of the bill, there is no language related to metrics. So it remains to be seen whether or not that will come to pass, and if the bill is even moved on this year. In terms of where we go from here, we have a few different regional bodies that are currently underway. San Jose Airport has formed an ad hoc advisory committee on South Flow arrivals, and Councilmember Koo is Palo Alto's representative to that body, and they have agreed to try to complete their work within approximately 120 days. So that's a temporary ad hoc committee looking at the impact of South Flow arrivals on neighboring communities. The SFO Community Roundtable has been around since the 1980s. It consists of representatives from the City and County of San Francisco, the County of San Mateo, and the 18 cities within the County of San Mateo. It was originally designed based on who was being impacted from the noise directly adjacent to the airport. Given the dynamics with NextGen and the increased impact on communities further out from the airport, the SFO Roundtable has now begun discussing the feasibility of inviting additional membership, which is something they haven't considered since they were formed in the 80s. So that's a rather significant development, and they have proposed considering having one representative from the County of Santa Clara and one representative from the County of Santa Cruz added to their about 20 or so seats that are on the SFO Roundtable. And then the Cities Association of Santa Clara County has formed an ad hoc roundtable committee, and that roundtable committee is meeting temporarily to develop a proposal to form a permanent South Bay Roundtable in partnership with Santa Cruz County that would have representatives from the cities and the county in Santa Clara as well as Santa Cruz. Councilmember Scharf is Palo Alto's representative on the ad hoc roundtable. I want to be clear, that's the ad hoc roundtable that would then help design the permanent roundtable. And then the question would be, what would Palo Alto's representation on the permanent roundtable look like? The notion of these committees, I think, is particularly important for us to think about as we think about next steps, because one of the things that was very clear in the FAA report is in answer to many different issues throughout the report, there were several recurring themes. And the FAA kept going back to issues of congestion, flying distance, and noise shifting as issues that they did not feel comfortable responding to until the competing interests of airline stakeholders and different affected communities were addressed by either the Select Committee, which has since sunset, or the SFO Roundtable. And so what I understand from reading that from a federal agency is they're really looking to the local community to reach some consensus in speaking to the federal agency about what is desired in the local community. So Palo Alto being engaged through regional committees and roundtables is one of the things that staff is recommending we look at very seriously so that we have a seat at the table and we're able to more effectively communicate with a federal agency that has declared it's really not interested in responding to sort of one-off inquiries from different communities that aren't reaching a consensus at the local level in our region. So the recommendations in your staff report from staff are to actively support and participate in those community roundtables, and we should probably look at what kind of staff support might be required to make that kind of participation feasible. To request temporary noise monitoring from SFO, to continue to address noise issues as our legislative priorities in lobbying in Washington, D.C., and some specific council positions. Now, I titled this slide Starting Recommendations because I suspect these won't be the limit of council positions. So we don't want you to infer that staff thinks this should be the limit of council positions. And I suspect after hearing from the public, we might hear some really good suggestions about additional positions the council might want to consider. But we would start with calling for improvements to SFO's Fly Quiet program, adherence to the altitude agreement I described earlier, maximizing the use of Bodega East whenever possible. They've said they support that, but continuing to press for it should help us in the short term. Maximizing sequencing as technology allows it to improve, adoption of improved metrics, and greater community engagement by the FAA and the airports. So those are the starting of staff recommendations, and at this point, I will cease with my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. This was really comprehensive. I'd like to go to public comment. Do we have any other speakers or folks who would like to submit a speaker card? Rob?
Council members, I just want to follow up on Councilmember Boy's question about the pre and post OAPM, and it is related to the next gen. In fact, it stands for Optimization of Airspace and Procedures in the Metroplex, and the Metroplex is the area that covers the 3 airports that Michelle talked about.
Thank you. So our first speaker is Mary Jo Fremont, to be followed by Briggs Nisbet. And let's do 2 minutes per speaker, since I suspect we may have a few. Welcome.
Thank you. Dear council members, my name is Mary Jo Fremont. I'm here tonight to make specific requests on the subject of airplane noise on behalf of other Palo Alto residents who have paid close attention to this issue since 2015. Request number 1, we support the starting staff recommendations and would like to propose 3 more items. Item A, advocate for solutions to reduce the health impact of both airplane noise and emissions. The negative health effects of both noise and emissions have been documented through various studies. Item B, collaborate with other elected officials to establish a regional position and ask the FAA to solve the problem with system-wide solutions, not independent point solutions. Item C, develop a noise monitoring plan in concert with others, be it airports, roundtables, airplane noise committees, or other cities that are affected by airplane noise. Request number 2, direct staff to put in place a fast-track process by the end of June to allow the city, if necessary, to file a complaint within 60 days of the FAA implementing a change. The city may never have to use it, but must be ready to act, if necessary, under the 60-day FAA deadline to file. Request number 3, write a letter to the FAA and congressional representatives as a response to the FAA update on Phase 2 report from November 2016. The response should highlight in particular that the Select Committee recommendation to move the Surfer ground track to the old Big Sur ground track was for a new procedure that would follow 9 criteria, including flying at idle power all the way to the bay and at altitudes at or higher than the previous Big Sur procedure along the entire route. Thank you. And I'll give you a copy of my statement.
Very well. Thank you very much. Mr. Briggs Nisbet is next.
So Briggs and I are, wait till you get to my.
Thank you.
Okay. You just, okay.
I'm Briggs and Iyer, one comment. I may not need all the time.
I see your card
Okay.
next, so we'll just
Thank you.
combine those. Thank you.
Councilmember Fine. My name is Jennifer Landesman, Sky Posse Palo Alto. I'm part of a sizable and growing collective of citizens working to reduce noise over Palo Alto and neighboring cities since the Next Gen noise problem began in 2014. I would like to actually note that who all is here because of jet noise, and many of you were here in 2015 when we did the first presentation about jet noise, and I just want to recognize all of these people because they are the force behind a lot of the data and the analysis that is going on, and just, you know, shout out to everyone. In the now 4 years of working on this problem, I note that FAA has 2 methods of engagement with communities to address noise. Working through community roundtable systems in Congress, the other method is litigation. Both methods have been employed to address NextGen in the last 3 years, by communities around the country, sometimes in combination. The Select Committee was a special effort to identify remedies for Palo Alto and the region, specifically for impacts from SFO southern arrivals. It was fruitful to engage directly with the FAA for 6 months. The committee, however, had a limitation that they were, per their own admission, and this was recorded in a vote, not experts. And the final menu of options, to some extent, did not fully address even some of the basics of problems about next-gen navigation issues related to noise. As an FAA official mentioned to me at the very end when we were all shaking hands, he said, "I know we didn't get to your area's issues, so you need to come back to us." I believe that while next-gen navigation allows planes to fly closer together and there's a lot of technology, truly what solves safety and efficiency for FAA and the industry is the bigger swath of space that they are using over our homes in order to land all these planes, which is a brutal impact on Palo Alto. So we are the solution to safety and efficiency, not necessarily the technology. The FAA has said they will continue working. We need to keep working on remedies. I may not have time, but a lot of the things that happen with the Select Committee have changed, including that also there's going to be a new landing system.
Thank you.
And is that both Briggs and mine?
We don't combine them. It's
Oh,
one
you
person.
don't?
So do you want to finish your last thought,
Okay,
please?
I just wanted to mention that the city has the Top Gun aviation law attorney, Mr. Kirsch. Thank you to City Attorney Molly Stump for having hosted him this year with several residents. I think as next steps proceed, we need to look at all options, and we just look to your energy and commitment to this because it matters to so many people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Carrie Yarkin is next.
Okay, good evening. I was going to run off my old letter that I wrote 4 years ago when this all started, but I decided not to, so I went to your city hot topics under airplane noise. You have 48 key documents. I counted them all. There's just so much has gone on. 4 years, documents, select committee meetings, letters, all the stuff. But where are we? It's as bad as it was in 2014, that summer when it all started. Now, most of you weren't on the council. I think you were, Karen. But so we are, okay, fine. There are all these committees. There's the roundtable. I just think at this point, after 4 years, not being able to sit in my backyard, do my gardening, relax, take a walk in my neighborhood, which is horrible, and without my noise canceling headphones, that you need to start the legal option. Okay, so that's where I am. I feel that you need to, okay, fine, do these little committees and join with Los Altos. Go get together with people from Newport Beach, Phoenix, Laguna Beach, Georgetown, and the state of Maryland, who are fighting the FAA and what the FAA has done to their livability of their citizens. I am here as just a citizen of Palo Alto. I would like to be here, but I feel that the noise has really impacted my life, my family's life, our ability to live here. We are here for 4 more years, everyone. I have kids going through high school, but you know what? This is just not acceptable. So that's where I stand. This is 4 years later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we could refrain from clapping, that'd be appreciated by all. Thank you. Next is Karen Porter, followed by John Koval.
Thank you to staff for providing an excellent summary of the FAA report and the situation we find ourselves in. As with other speakers, though, I agree that we need to really push back strongly against the FAA, and in particular by responding in writing. The report is just entirely disingenuous and conclusory in numerous respects. As one example, we should say we should continue to push for an honest evaluation of alternative waypoints to Menlo. We're not saying no flights over Menlo, but just our fair share. The FAA rejected Faith, which would have brought flights in a northerly direction east of the bay, because supposedly this would conflict with Diamond, which run, as you could see from that slide 16, runs from east to west. But this fails to recognize that 3 routes are now converging over Menlo. What about that conflict? We should also continue to push for a minimum altitude of 5,000 feet at Menlo. The FAA said it could only do 4,000 because of the glide path into SFO, yet there are a certain percentage of flights over 5,000, although not enough. So that indicates this is feasible. Moreover, the 4,000 minimum altitude is not even honored on a regular basis. I have a handout which I'll leave that shows I'm about 2 miles southeast of Menlo Waypoint, and regularly flights come in under 3,000 over my house, and some even in the 2,000s. So the FAA needs to be held to, at a minimum, their 4,000 commitment and pushed for the 5,000 minimum as well. Also, the FAA, without any prior discussion, implemented or created a new flight path called Surfer Star or Surfer 3 with its own new waypoint. But the FAA did not provide any map showing this new flight path, just some coordinates. From what we can tell, the path is slightly east of Surfer, which happens to be right over my neighborhood, Duveneck, as well as East Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. Despite the FAA's professed concern for noise shifting, the FAA conveniently was not concerned as it pertains to Surfer 3. And I'm out of time. I have many more disagreements with the FAA report that I will submit to staff.
Please be sure to show up when we have another meeting, or just send us an email.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. John Koval is our final speaker.
Hi there, I'm John Koval, I'm from Palo Alto. I grew up in Orange County, and we handled the noise by telling the FAA what we wanted and what they needed to do and putting our foot down. And it worked. It was not easy, and so far all I see is Palo Alto does not even have a seat at the table. Palo Alto, none of our neighbors, they're all ecstatic that the whole next-gen thing has happened because it's put all the noise over those rich people in Palo Alto. So they're not going to support you in it. We need to make our own seat. The FAA really is using smoke and mirrors to distract us to other things and say they can't do anything for us. They love having all these routes coming over us. The worst is the Class B airspace, reducing the level for the Class B airspace under 4,000 feet. All that does is put them lower over us. They're already under 4,000 frequently, particularly the oceanic flights, which are the 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., which are the most annoying. They are not even considered in any of this that we're talking about. That would be an easy one to change. Send them over the Golden Gate, have them do Bodega East, right to the airport. Boom. It'd be a piece of cake to do that. So that's it. We need a seat at the table. We need to hear our voice needs to be heard by them. Right now, they could care less. We're not even on a committee, as far as I can see. We weren't on the South Bay Select Committee, and there's a reason. None of our neighbors, because they don't want this over them. The pollution, all of it. It's bad.
Thank you. We have one last speaker, R. Finn. Welcome.
Okay. These are very impromptu remarks. I was not expecting to speak. I didn't know the manner in which this meeting would be organized. I thank you for the opportunity. I'm one of those who have lived through the transition. I was a resident of Palo Alto long before 2014, and I'm still a resident of Palo Alto. In 2014, there was a very dramatic change. Prior to 2014, nobody that I knew gave a thought to any problems with airplane noise. During 2014, a discontinuous transition occurred. Suddenly, we were deluged with noise. There must have been a reason for a discontinuous transition. Airplanes have continued to fly over us perhaps with increasing frequency, but continuously increasing frequency. But the sudden change in 2014 has to be ascribed to something very dramatic that occurred just at that time. I think we all know what that dramatic thing was. We were not informed in advance. It took months after the change before I had any idea what was the thing that happened that suddenly increased the airplane noise. We have gotten no response from the FAA, as everybody has remarked. I've seen some disingenuous responses, and I have them on record in my files. I'd be glad to make them available. I think the FAA has been grossly dishonest with us, and I think we should respond on that level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we'll return to council. Just to set the stage, staff is asking us to endorse these starting recommendations and send them to our colleagues at council for full endorsement. But I'll open it up for comments, questions. Councilmember Holman.
So through the chair, I was anticipating quite a number of speakers, and I know Jennifer Landesman and Karen Porter did not get to finish their comments, and given there were only 6 speakers, I would like to allow them the extra minute to provide any additional information they would like to do.
Thank you. To be fair to everyone, I'm going to keep it at 2 minutes.
But the others finished within that time, and those 2 did not. That's why I'm asking for those 2 speakers to be granted more time.
If you have questions of anybody of the speakers, that'd be great.
Yeah, I want to know what they weren't able to say.
So look, I know most meetings run at 3 minutes per public speaker. I chose to use 2 minutes
speakers.
because we have 4 items tonight. We have speakers on perhaps all of them. And I do want to give everybody a chance to comment. There are going to be multiple places to do that here at council through email. And so I decided to limit it to 2 minutes. If you have specific questions of the speakers, please feel free to ask them. But I decided to go for 2 minutes tonight.
I think if I was an attorney, I would say exception. Somebody else start, because I was thinking about this.
Councilmember Wolbach.
Excuse me. First, I want to say thank you to staff for an excellent presentation. I think that set it up for us very well. I appreciate that in your time on the city staff, you've gotten up to speed on this in an impressive manner. And for those who came to speak tonight, thank you very much for your input. I know it's been a long slog, and I wish I could say the end was in sight, but you know, in the end of the day, your job is to advocate to us, and on this issue, we're not the decision makers, so all we can do is be advocates on your behalf. But thanks for trying to give us the information that we can use as ammo when we go to the FAA. Starting with that, in March of last year, was on March 17th of last year, 4 of us on council, along with, at the time, Mayor Keith of Menlo Park, our lobbyists from Van Scoyoc, and also city staff, met with several members of, I was on the 14th of March, met with the FAA in Washington, D.C. Councilmember Fine was there, as well as Councilmember Scharf and Councilmember Niss, at the time Mayor and Vice Mayor respectively. In that meeting with the FAA, they gave us some, I thought, very potentially promising, though I took it all with a grain of salt, information. They said that they had their AEE, or the FAA AEE, the Office of Environment and Energy, doing a study on noise to set standards for looking at noise differently, for doing different metrics. So they said they were already working on that. They said they were working on that, doing a study in concert with MIT. They also said that they had an executive committee called the Noise Steering Committee. They said they had created something internally within their own bureaucracy called the Noise Complaint Initiative that was trying to unify and standardize noise input. So this is a national effort, right? We talk about what we can do to align our advocacy with other communities around the country. And the FAA told us that through their Noise Complaint Initiative, they were trying to unify and standardize how they took noise input so that they could provide recommendations to that noise steering committee, and that there was a noise ombudsman in AEE. Again, that's the FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. That's what we heard on the 14th of March last year. And so when I hear that they're doing all of that from them to our faces, that they are already looking at dealing with noise differently. And then less than a year later, they say, oh, we can't look at noise differently until Congress makes us. I wonder what I'm missing. And I'm wondering if staff has any thoughts on that, guidance on that, in the context of we're going back to DC next month and hoping to get some FaceTime with the FAA again. I don't want to scream at them, but I want us to have productive conversations with them. But I'm just wondering if I'm missing something, or if this is a disconnect that's worth pointing out.
I can confirm in the research I've done that there is work being done at MIT and other locations, and the FAA does provide grants for some of that kind of work through universities and public-private partnerships. And many of the airlines contribute to that as well. So there's a partnership there that between the federal government and some of the stakeholders. I will just offer the observation that I don't want to speak for the FAA, but I will say that the update report, by any report like this by a federal agency, is probably written with an eye toward whether or not there are any openings in it that would leave the agency vulnerable to a legal challenge. And so they probably have to weigh what they put in writing in a report as compared to what they might discuss face-to-face, and whether or not those details might vary in specificity.
I can understand that. Have we heard from the FAA through any other avenues, any follow-up on any of the things that I just listed?
The FAA has not responded directly to any of our letters, so we have not heard from them directly. They have spoken through their report.
So they've not responded to our letters. Okay, that's interesting. Next area of question. In your staff report, one of the attachments, you talk about noise, N-O-I-S-E. You didn't talk about it much during your presentation. It sounds like this is a potential collaborative that we could be part of, partnering with other communities around the country. Staff want to take this opportunity to tell us more about NOISE, and what kind of potential that could have for us.
Sure, absolutely. NOISE is the acronym for an advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. That communities from around the country belong to. It stands for the National Association to Ensure a Sound, Controlled Environment. The attachment in your staff report includes their positions. These are federal lobbying positions around airplane noise and impact. They include noise metrics review, greater community engagement, health impact studies, which was one of the things that one of our speakers this evening recommended as well, sound installation program funding, air traffic, opposing any privatization of the air traffic control system, and efforts to reinstitute the EPA Office of Noise Abatement and Control. So those are the positions that the organization took in 2017. The organization also coordinates a workshop annually at the National League of Cities conference that's held in Washington, D.C. So if any council members are going to that conference in Washington this year, Washington, D.C. this year, they can meet members of this association, get briefed on what's happening at the national level on these kinds of concerns, and probably meet with folks from other communities that are also advocating for their communities on these issues.
So I think at least 3 or 4, 5 council members are going to DC. 2 of us here are going to DC, so we'll work with staff to work out schedules and see if we can get at least a couple of us there for that. And does staff have any other thoughts, even if qualitative, about how effective you think this group is, or how nascent or how mature it is? Whether it's worth investing our time, basically, or whether we should keep working through local and through our lobbyists? Or is this a situation where we should pursue any and all alternative?
Our staff recommendations include multiple methods on multiple fronts, and we would stand by those recommendations.
Okay. On the House versus the Senate recommendations, going back to this idea of getting some congressional nudge to get the FAA to act, where's the status of that? Has it gone to a conference committee or anything yet? What's going on with that? Because normally, as I understand, when you have a House bill and a Senate bill that are slightly different, but to the same end, they need to have some kind of reconciliation process.
That's correct. They have not proceeded. They haven't been called up for a floor vote yet.
Is that just because they've been busy with other things and shutting down the government, or like do we have have we heard from our lobbyists about what the timeline is for that going forward?
We have, there is no indication of if or when it will move forward this year. So a number of months ago, the thinking was that we would see an FAA reauthorization this year. Now, folks following that legislation are less confident than they were a number of months ago that it's likely to move this year, given the competing priorities on the horizon.
So what happens if the FAA authorization bill doesn't move forward? Do they just continue with the prior authorization, or?
Yeah, the reauthorization bills frequently get held up, and so it's, in theory, they're required to occur when the previous authorizing legislation sunsets, but in practice, the status quo continues until the next reauthorization bill is passed.
Similar to, hypothetically, if a city didn't finish its new comprehensive plan by the time the old one expired. Got it. And as a comment on this, there are many times we have here where the city staff will recommend something to the council and not wait for the council to provide the direction. And so the argument that the FAA can't do anything until Congress directs them, I find pretty ludicrous, to be quite blunt, especially in light of what we've heard from them in the past. We also got some comments, and we also got a written letter with some recommendations from Mary Jo Fremont. Has staff had a chance to look these over? Before going to them, I just want to ask if staff has had a chance to look at them.
I am familiar with many of the ideas expressed, yes.
Are there any here that you think are going to be challenging, or does staff have any comments on these at this point?
With respect to the first one, solutions regarding health, emissions, et cetera, that's consistent with positions that the city has taken in the past, and I think would be consistent with the recommendations to continue to make the impacts of airplanes on citizens a priority, whether it's noise or other factors like emissions. So I think that's consistent and doesn't represent any issues. With respect to collaborating on a regional position, I think that's directly in alignment with staff's observations about the value of collaboration. And with respect to a broader noise monitoring plan, certainly Palo Alto's ability to have impact with limited noise monitoring within the city would likely be strengthened if it were done in coordination with noise monitoring elsewhere. So that seems to be something that staff would concur with as a healthy suggestion.
And then there were 2 other kind of areas of suggestions. One was to be ready
Yes.
to act, perhaps legally or perhaps through other mechanisms in response to.
If I may,
Makes sense
let me
for me.
jump to the last one, and
Oh,
then
sure.
I'm
Yeah,
going to
suggestion
defer
for
to legal counsel on the second to the last one. The last one was sending a letter to the FAA, and staff would certainly have no objections to summarizing all the positions that the council ultimately wants to express into another letter to the FAA. I don't think there's anything wrong with getting on the record with the FAA. I think expecting a direct response in a timely fashion is probably not realistic given past experience.
Given that they haven't responded to any of our letters in the last year.
But I think being on record, staff would have no objections to that. Specifically, the reference to the 9 criteria, we did not get into the surfer, Big Sur topic specifically in our staff report, but that would again be supporting a position that the select committee took, and I think the staff would have no objections to that if council wanted to weigh in on that particular issue as well, and would certainly defer to council on its thoughts on that. And staff can give council much more background information on that topic. And I'll defer to legal counsel on the issue of being prepared to act within 60 days.
Sure, thank you. City Attorney Molly Stump. So we are certainly watching the situation very carefully. As Ms. Landesman indicated, we do have on contract here at the city Peter Kirsch and his law firm, Kaplan Kirsch Rockwell, who are national experts in airport and airline law. They were, in fact, the counsel who represented one successful litigant, the city of Phoenix. And we have had Peter out a couple times to talk with community members, including, I think it was maybe about 4 or 5 months ago. He came and did a roundtable with, I think many of the folks who are here tonight did get a chance to meet and speak directly with him and ask him questions. And I think as he represented at that time, we do not have an actionable legal situation before us right now. He did have a lot of encouragement about working with regional partners, working through our political representatives, and how to work with the FAA. And I think the suggestion to continue to watch and be ready is, in fact, what we need to do on the legal front. I would mention that I did have a conversation with Peter. I speak with him fairly frequently. And I did have a conversation with him about the recent FAA report, and we both focused on the same language, which is early in the report, where the FAA does formally state that the issuance of this report is not a final action that would trigger an environmental review, a moment to look at the process that they went through on environmental review, and it doesn't reopen their prior action either. So what they've essentially said there is, you can't sue us based on this, we're just talking. And so we're watching and waiting. That's exactly the right posture, and we will look to our involved community and our citizens to help us to spot any development that, could become an actionable legal item.
Okay, so before we get to motions, I also wanted to ask staff, and thank you for that feedback and having already taken a look at the written input from the public on this one. Are there any items here which you think are redundant or unnecessary? Would there be any harm in adding, at least in rough form, these recommendations to a motion tonight? Would that in any way micromanage or bind the hands of staff or be redundant of other efforts already underway, or would these be acceptable to staff and allow you to continue with your work?
I don't think anything here that we've discussed thus far would bind our hands. The one piece I would suggest you might want us to give you more information about is the criteria for the surfer, Big Sur issue. I think I don't think there's anything there that's troubling to staff, but because it is not a policy position that the council took in the past, staff would want to make sure that the council understood the elements of the policy position before taking a position on it. So we'd want to make sure to bring you the information of what that means.
So if we included something like that in a motion tonight, this would, of course, have to go to council anyway, because this body can't make decisions. We can only make recommendations, and that might provide staff the time to include either, whether it's on consent as a written report, or if it's on action, a presentation to explain that gap in council's information.
Absolutely. We would include it in the report, and then, if the committee would like us to include it in the recommendations, we'd forward it as a recommendation with the background information.
Okay. With that, Chair Fine, are you okay with going to motions, or would you like to?
I'm okay with that.
Okay. Well, then I'd like to make a motion, which is to move the staff recommendations with a couple of additions. And I think maybe the best way to phrase this is it acceptable to say, to ask staff to incorporate the written letter from the public?
Sure.
We'll do that then.
And by the written letter, you're referring to the one from Ms. Fremont?
Correct.
Yes.
And I'll second that, if is that the whole motion?
I think that sums it up.
Thank you. Do you want to speak to your motion, or have you already?
I've spoken a lot on this item already, so I won't say much, but again, I really want to just reiterate, thank you to staff for a lot of work from multiple departments and offices on this effort for years now, including recently, and thank you also to the members of the public for making it easier for us, both council and staff, to get our heads around this. And the research time that you've put in makes our jobs easier, and hopefully that will allow us to speak with a stronger voice regionally and nationally. So thank you.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to speak to your second, and then I'll come back to you, Karen.
Yeah, I do. Is this close enough? So first of all, thanks for the overview. I think this is probably the third or fourth time it's come to policy and services. So I mean, we have heard a lot of this before. It's a complex issue, but we've had a lot of time to study it. I think, I became aware of this issue in 2014. I heard a lot from the community, and so it's been a long time. So I do appreciate the presentation. I think I want to challenge some of the conclusions. I mean, looking at passengers and tons of shipping doesn't necessarily imply more flights. And I think probably the most telling thing is the if operations are flights. If you look at slide 4, I mean, we're still below the peak of the dot-com boom in 97 to 2000. So I'm not sure the airport has really grown. And if they're saying, they're going to grow in the future, as far as I know, like SFO is not, are they building another runway? I don't think they're able to, right? So I would just challenge that idea that I think things have definitely changed in 2014. It was a very noticeable shift in noise. And I agree with some of the public comments that the communities that now have less noise are not particularly eager to get it back. So, I think this is mostly about fuel savings and glide path. And, it's really about big business and saving that gas, which is good for the environment, but it's also a health issue with noise and emissions. And so if we can, the 9 criteria, which we're talking about shifting the altitude to be able to glide and come in at over 5,000 feet, makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's time for us to be much stronger on these points. And the UK, it has much stronger regulations in terms of noise and public safety. And, I appreciate the staff recommendations. They still seem like they're not really going to affect any change. And so I guess the question is, what else can we do? And so, Molly, I'd really like to understand more about the success that some of these other cities have had. And, again, there's been a lot of confusion about whether we had notice or not in 2014. So, why is it not actionable? What are the constraints?
Right. So Every situation is unique, and you have to consider all of the facts and circumstances as well as the legal issues. So I think you're referring to the Phoenix situation.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Newport Beach and, yeah, Phoenix, other cities.
Right.
California in particular seems to have had some success.
A few,
Yeah.
a few. There are a few successes, not a tremendous number in litigating against the FAA. So, I'm not prepared to discuss all of the various litigation, but each of the cases is different depending on when it was filed and what the facts were, the precursor facts. The Phoenix case, the court had before it a set of facts around the FAA's behavior that was quite distinctive. There was, in fact, even less, quite dramatically less notice in that set of changes. That was one of the very early ones than there were in the Northern California area. And then as the local community began to dialogue with the FAA, the representations that they made, the court ended up finding that the FAA had discouraged locals from taking any legal action by their specific representations, which they learned from what the situation they got themselves in, and those situations were not replicated in other areas. So the court there actually gave the litigants an exception to what is otherwise a very strict and very short statute of limitations that the public has now become aware of. It's quite unusual in the law to have that short of a time.
So
to
when
bring a
Next
legal
Gen rolled
challenge.
out, there was an EIR done, and that EIR closed, is that
It's
the
not
issue?
an EIR, it's under federal environmental law, so it's an analogous, but in many ways similar, in some ways different,
Yep.
set of environmental rules.
And even though the community has been filing all these noise complaints, that's not a basis for bringing some kind of legal action?
So the actions that the FAA took were some time ago, and two things happened. One, there wasn't a legal challenge filed immediately within that window, and then there actually was a legal challenge brought out of Portola Valley. And what the courts, which was not successful and was dismissed. So as Mr. Kirsch reflected and shared with the community, when issues are raised and they're resolved in the court, they're essentially foreclosed. So we have a situation where there was a challenge brought, and it was considered in the court system and resolved, unfortunately, not favorably to
So
the
even though
community noise
we're in a
concerns.
different location than Portola Valley, why does that apply to us?
Federal court procedural doctrine. So we are in a position where we will be watching for a change that could create an actionable event, and then we would get to the council right away to talk about whether, there is some kind of a claim and what council may want to do
I mean,
about it. Of
you
course, if
referred
the
to them
council
saying this
wants
wasn't a
to.
final action. As soon as it's final, are we allowed to say, we went through this process and we didn't resolve anything? I mean, what does the final action have to do?
Well, so I'm referring to the FAA's own language
Yes.
about their rules and approaches. By saying it's not a final action under the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the federal analogous environmental law statute to CEQA, which you're more familiar with, and that it doesn't reopen their prior action. They're essentially saying, well, you're still too late on the second thing, and you're too early on anything else. So we're in a waiting period.
So what about issues with them going below 4,000 feet? Do we have any, if we start to identify flights that are coming in too low, can we take any action on those?
So I think rather than go down this road with you
Yeah.
of giving you live legal and risk advice, we should probably use the traditional way in which we advise you. And not sort of try to pull this apart at that level of detail.
Saying that we're waiting. I'd really like to understand what our options are to suggest to the council that it's time that we initiate some kind of legal action. So you're saying we basically have no grounds in any dimension on this thing currently, and you can't answer that now. I guess could we have some back to council to include an option for that?
So traditionally, this kind of advice is given confidentially to the governing body, and it is my ethical responsibility to do that for you and all of your colleagues. So I can do that. You don't need to make a motion. If council as a body votes to waive any privileges it has around confidential legal advice, you can disclose that and share it with the public. I am comfortable saying to you, because we had a fairly frank and open conversation with our community when our outside counsel was here, that it is his recommendation and view at this point that there is not a lawsuit to be had. So I don't have hesitation in discussing that with you at that level of generality. If you'd like a more detailed report on the various complaints and concerns that folks have, we could do that in a confidential forum. But unfortunately, again, at the high level, the things that concern the community and are problematic are not necessarily legally actionable. The FAA has very broad authority to manage the national airspace, and in fact considers airports that are part of the national airspace to be national assets, not local assets. And when the planes are in the air, they have very broad authority to manage where and how they fly. So the fact that it causes concern, injury, et cetera, in local communities is more of a policy and an advocacy issue than necessarily a legally actionable one. In other words, there's not necessarily a legal right to be free of these problems that are generated by the national air system.
So, so we did include, I guess, this idea of a 60-day fast-track process in the motion. You didn't really answer the question, I guess, when it came up. Do we need a special process to be able to react that quickly?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. What question did I not answer?
So the suggestion in the memo is that the staff has a fast-track process that will allow us to respond within the I'm not sure where the 60-day time frame is coming from.
Councilmember Du Bois, what motion are you looking at? You're looking at the Ms. Fremont's memo?
Which was incorporated into the motion.
Okay, so we don't, and your question is, do we need a special process?
Well, first of all, I'd like to understand where the 60 days is coming from.
60 days is the statute of limitations to file a lawsuit against the FAA for an actionable action that they may take.
Right. And then, so again, I just wanted to point out that we are asking for this process to make sure we can make those 60 days.
That's not a problem.
Okay.
I mean, what we need to do is we need to have at least a few conversations internally, do some analysis. We need to get to council. Council has to authorize that. We do that in closed session, but you meet almost weekly, and I'm sure that the council would schedule a special meeting for an item of this importance. Come together and hear from the city's lawyers and make a decision to authorize the initiation of a lawsuit. And then one is prepared. Filing a lawsuit is not, it's not a problem with the resources that we have and the experts that we have already on contract within that period of time. A couple of weeks is plenty of time to prepare a complaint.
Okay.
So we don't need any special procedures.
Okay. And I do agree with a lot that's in this memo. I think, again, the community has talked about a lot of issues, but this memo says, to emphasize 1.2 R1 and R2, which are specifically talk about the height and the route that they come in on. And again, to me, looking at the historic data, it seems like, again, the biggest thing that's changed is the height of the planes. And even 1,000 feet makes a huge difference in terms of noise. So I hope it's clear. I know we don't normally take on the FAA. I think it's time that we stand up a bit more. We can do all these other activities. I don't really have a lot of hope that being on the select committee is going to help Palo Alto in particular. So I'm trying to interpret what you said. I think if this is what you were saying, I mean, I would like to request that we schedule a closed session to understand the lawsuits that have been successful, and it to go over with council kind of what would be actionable and what our options are legally.
We can do that.
Okay, so I would like to just add that to the motion, that we will have a closed session to talk about, I guess, the legal environment surrounding airplane noise.
Is that something we'd need in the motion in order to do? Or is there any harm in putting that in the motion?
There's no harm.
Okay, I would accept that as a friendly amendment. And is the city clerk capturing this? All right, and we should probably review the motion before the vote on it. Just make sure we got it all.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Du Bois. Councilmember Holman?
Yes, and could, Jessica, since you captured the motion, and sometimes it's easier for the clerk than the maker of the motion, but one of the two of you, if you would repeat the part that talked about incorporation of these comments from the letter from the public.
Sure. So the motion as it currently stands is the staff recommendation. So it's the exact
Plus.
wording that you see on the screen. And ask staff to incorporate the written letter from Ms. Fremont into the motion. And then additionally, also request staff to schedule a closed session to better understand lawsuits that have been successful on this subject.
So clarification about incorporate. Was the intention would be to incorporate the content of this in the city's letter, not just attach this letter to our letter, correct?
Well, my intention was to incorporate this into the motion.
Thank you.
Right, because this.
Yeah, I got that.
This includes several items that would be directives to staff and would guide our actions as a city. And so my intention was to include these in our motion.
In our direction.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, good. So others have been more intimately and directly involved in this. I've not been on policy and services, for instance. And I have a question about, and Tom covered the things about legal options. I have another one about environmental impacts, because I remember going back a ways, the FAA conceded that their environmental analysis and their criteria were outdated. Has there been any update to that? And I don't know who wants to answer that. Have they updated their standards by which they evaluate the environmental impact on communities?
No, and I think Deputy City Manager Flaherty spoke to the situation with the development of the standard.
Yeah, with respect to noise metrics, that was the last item in our recommendations. If you're not referring to noise, then metrics, then I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I was referring to noise metric, and maybe you're saying the same thing with noise metrics is one thing, but I view it a little bit differently about the environmental impacts. So measuring things is one thing, but analyzing what the impacts of those metrics are on a community are going another step. So that's what I'm referring to. And it's not just noise, but it's also, it's those impacts on health, and that would also include air quality impacts, because there's a lot of particulate. So I'm taking that extra step. And is there any update on that? Because it's been a long time.
No, the closest thing to an update on that would be the appendix in the staff report that provides the update from our lobbyists in DC providing an update on the language in the House bill of the FAA reauthorization bill. That's as close to progress as we've seen on that. And you also see the language in the advocacy positions of the noise organization.
Thank you for that. And so I think I'll have something to add to the motion about environmental impacts. So I looked up the, the FAA reauthorization bill, and there's a lot of like, not our jurisdiction, their jurisdiction, we don't do this, they do that, and there's a lot of that, and it's indicated in the report as well. I also looked at the House subcommittee, and the Senate is kind of like King's X, but so the House has 22 criteria that they use. Issues and agencies under the jurisdiction of the Aviation Subcommittee include, and there are 22 things there, and the only one that even comes close to addressing what we're dealing with is something referred to as airspace matters, which doesn't indicate to me that it could be at all impacts on the community. It's just like congestion and such. I don't know specifically what it refers to. It just says airspace matters. I also looked at, there are 39 members on this subcommittee. 5 are representatives from California. And I'm kind of wondering, are we pushing our legislators hard enough? Are our lobbyists pushing our legislators hard enough?
Couple of observations about that. You had observed how many representatives were from California. There's a lot of power in diversifying one's base of support in Washington, D.C., and noise is a concern in a lot of communities, Boston, Chicago, others. And so our representative, Congresswoman Eshoo, has actually joined with representatives from across the country to form the Quiet Skies Caucus in Congress, which takes positions on just these kinds of issues, the impact on their communities with respect to aircraft. So, so in addition to all of the information that is available on our delegation's members' websites about their activities, I know that also at a national level, they're banding together with others to make their voices heard.
And how expanded is that?
I'm not sure I understand your
Congresswoman
question.
Eshoo's initiative, how expanded is that? How expansive is that?
I don't want to speak for Congresswoman Eshoo's office or for the representative directly, but there's a thorough and comprehensive listing of all of the activities on her website. So if members of the public wanted to go to her website and do a search for airplane noise, there's a very comprehensive list of information going back for several years, press releases as well as reports coming out of the FAA. I will point out that the report, I've been referring to it as the update on Phase 2 or the Phase 2 update. The reason it's called that is because the FAA did the Phase 1 report, then it did the Phase 2 report in July of 2017, and then it did the update on Phase 2 in November of 2017. And if you look at the formal title of all of these reports, they say compiled at the request of Representatives Farr or Panetta, Eshoo, and Speer. And so I think that's an indication that we wouldn't have any of this if it weren't for the congressional delegation. And I will only offer that as a former federal government employee, it's pretty rare to see a federal agency do something like this in a region. So I think my assessment is that the congressional delegation has been quite proactive on this issue in order to get this kind of activity out of the FAA. I'm not suggesting I find the responses favorable, but I am suggesting there's activity there.
And I don't mean to, I probably didn't state that very well. I don't mean to suggest that, Congresswoman Eshoo, Speer, that are not doing due diligence. I'm just wondering if we need to provide them more support to get a broader engagement, to get some activity. And that's what I don't have the answer to. Maybe those who are going to Washington can get an answer to that, but as you say, the responses are not leading to, satisfaction is such a, it sounds like almost could be interpreted as a selfish goal or selfish desire. It's not that. It does go back to the basic core thing from my perspective, and I think the public's perspective is, it's about quality of life and health. And so satisfaction is, not to pick on words again, it just can sound like we're not getting what we want. But these are really critical life issues. So, so I'm actually going to look to, Michelle, I might look to you.
Did you see this about?
I'm sorry?
This is about health effects.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I did. And also, yes, I did. I read that. I might look to one of you for some help with language on this as an amendment to the motion to, it disappeared. Give me just a second here. Well, having to do with metrics, I don't see it here right offhand, but how we can add to that development of environmental impacts, development and update of environmental impacts of the current routing. It's a very inarticulate way of stating it, but you know what I'm getting at.
I think I understand. Ms. Fremont's letter spoke to the issue of emissions and health, and the national advocacy organization we referenced that goes by the acronym of NOISE also talks about health impact studies. And I think the spirit of your direction already to take a look at those positions and incorporate them into what we bring back to the full council in terms of a resolution, perhaps, of policy positions, we could certainly take a look at that language and flesh that out for you so that it gets at those issues.
So you think the language that's provided, for instance, in this letter, is strong enough to capture what I'm driving at?
I think it does. I think what you're saying is consistent with that.
Okay.
If I'm understanding you correctly.
Okay, all right. And then I think my last question is well, we'll see. Is there a maximum capacity being studied or considered at any of the local airports?
The only information I've gained from my research at all three airports are the projections I showed you that show growth with respect to passenger and cargo operations going forward. So their planning documents are projecting growth at all three airports.
So there's no consideration of what might be a maximum capacity, maximum airport capacity at the three airports?
There, it's interesting. The MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is the transportation planning agency for the region, for the 9-county Bay Area, in past years, had an aviation plan that was proposed to be updated periodically. And I did some research to ask if I could get a copy of the current plan, and they essentially haven't updated it at all, and they don't really work on it anymore. And
the last one was done when, did you say?
Oh, I'd have to check my records. But there's no staff committed to that at MTC anymore. And when I researched the older plans, it looked like, and in fairness to MTC, the majority of their work is really focused on what's referred to as surface transportation, which is transit and highways and whatnot. And so a lot of what they ended up really focusing on in the past was surface transportation access to the airports. So, is there a people mover from BART in Oakland to the airport itself and things like that. And so it really, I don't think air travel has really been in their bailiwick traditionally. And so where there might have been a regional air transportation working group, MTC would have been the logical place for that to be, and there is no current activity of that kind.
Interesting. Okay. And I asked that really because, not only because of the projected growth that you put in your presentation, and I want to concur, it was a very informative and informed presentation, so thank you for that. You've come up to speed very quickly. You really have. But when I looked through the, the House subcommittee, it all really focuses on, being able to service people via air travel. There's nothing that considers these other aspects that are so heavily impacting our community. So I think that's all I have to say. It sounds like what I was wanting to add doesn't need to be added because our public has covered that very well. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just a couple comments and one or two questions, and then maybe we can move to the motion. So again, thank you very much. I agree with my colleagues. I think you've come up to speed very well on this and helping to move us forward. You mentioned that in 2019 there's a few changes that are coming, potentially, right, through a couple years out from then. Part of the reason some of our citizens are asking for us to figure out a fast-track route to file an FAA complaint is because these could impact us negatively. I'm just wondering, could any of these actually improve the situation for Palo Alto?
Yes, they could make it worse or they could make it better. And
we don't know.
Right. And our staff recommendation includes trying to get a seat at the table to be a part of shaping those toward the better rather than the worse.
Okay. And then my second question is kind of about noise modeling or getting a noise shed, so we kind of understand and also can communicate to our neighbors. I think one of the problems here, Tom hit it on the head when he mentioned, other communities are not eager to get the noise back. There's kind of this shared externality, and it's easy to shift it onto somebody else. So like this kind of data, right? Is this publicly available on like a day-to-day basis?
Some of the data is from FAA presentations that were presented either to the Select Committee or to the SFO Roundtable. Some of it comes from monthly reports that the airport directors produce, or the airplane noise office, airport noise office produces. So they come from a variety of sources, the airports themselves or the FAA, and they're all publicly available.
Okay. I think something that would be helpful to us over time is kind of documenting that in-house so we can communicate to our partners. And rather than inventing our own noise monitoring systems, kind of leveraging the existing ones. But I do think there's something to these graphs kind of showing, hey, there's an intensity of use here in Palo Alto. Obviously, people are worried about it. And then also it might aid our proposals. I think my colleagues have asked all my other questions. I want to thank everybody from the public for the suggestions. Any other comments or questions, or are you us four ready to vote? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification. The FAA, the SFO Noise Office releases very thorough reports on the data they collect in the communities where they collect. They don't currently collect any data in Palo Alto. Okay. The other, so bringing in noise monitoring in Palo Alto would be a new development, which is why we included it in our recommendations. And even then, it would be temporary. So
how long is temporary?
We'll bring that to you when we
okay.
Bring you the more detailed proposal. We wanted direction from council to take that action before getting the details hammered out with SFO. One of the things I know has been a concern in some communities, the SFO does not do noise monitoring in all of the communities that are members of the roundtable because a minority of communities chose not to have noise monitoring because their residents had concerns about property values.
And the equipment for noise monitoring, or?
The impact on property values.
To indicate, even indicating that you're monitoring this data?
If the results.
Yeah.
If you have a noisy community,
yeah.
It could, so that was a concern in some communities. So not every community has chosen to and I provide that as anecdotal information.
Okay.
I haven't confirmed with those communities that was the reason. But I just wanted to sunshine that.
Like SFO would pay for the temporary monitoring, but if we wanted permanent, we would have to pay for it ourselves, I think is what they told us.
Yes, and if we wanted to do permanent monitoring, that opens up a whole other set of questions for us that we'd want to bring you some detailed
Right.
information on.
And so our best indicator right now is kind of the complaints, but
But
that's-
temporary noise monitoring from SFO would be a great first step.
yeah. Thank you.
And the recommendation, your current motion includes looking at a broader noise monitoring solution as part of going forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolbach?
Yeah, just as part of that, I'm not going to suggest any more amendments to the motion, but maybe as a comment to explore and encourage open data. That people can pull from automatically, so that we can visualize the data, sift the data, et cetera, in effective ways, rather than having to wait for a periodic report from a staff member at SFO. But again, I'm not going to add to the motion, but we can look into it more later.
Thank you. Are we all ready to vote? All in favor? Aye. That passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight. Let's move on to item number 2. All right, let's move on. A staff recommendation that the Policy and Services Committee recommend the City Council accept the status of update of the 2016 Disability and Workers' Compensation Rates Audit.
We have Auditor Harriet Richardson here with the Human Resources staff.
Thank you very much. Jessica, please. Thank you.
Do we want to take 2 minutes while people filter in and out?
No, I'm going for it. Okay, cool, thanks. Welcome. Well, maybe since Councilmember Holman is gone, we'll take a few. Sorry about that, but she just left. She's missing out. It's all yours.
Good evening, Councilperson Fine and council members. I'm Sandra Blanche. I'm the Assistant Director in Human Resources. Thank you for this opportunity to update you on the workers' compensation audit. I appreciate the support the city auditor has provided and the work that Yuki Matsura has completed. We especially give credit for the recommendation to appropriately resource the monitoring of the workers' compensation and safety programs by actively monitoring cases and being in frequent communication with our third-party administrator, York Insurance Services, as well as increasing communication with injured workers and their supervisors. We've found positive results. To date, we have completed 7 out of the 15 recommendations, and our senior HR administrator, Rhonda McCauley, has worked on 10 out of the 15 recommendations, and this is the position that was recommended. We did experience some delay last year due to the RFP process. We had to complete for the third-party administration service, which resulted in renewing York Insurance Services. But we feel that now we expect significant progress that will continue to wrap up the remaining audit recommendations. And I believe we will be back later this year for a follow-up update.
Thank you. Excuse me. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Harriet Richardson, City Auditor. Just wanted to comment that our office reviewed the status report that HR submitted prior to their submission of it, and that we concur with the status that they have stated in the report.
Thank you. Do we have any speakers from the public on this one? Nope. So staff is recommending that we accept this report and forward that recommendation to council. Do we have any questions? Councilmember Du Bois.
Yeah. So it looks like you're in agreement on all the resolutions,
Correct.
and it looks like most of them will complete this year, right? Like by summertime, is that the plan?
Yes, those are the target dates to be completed this year.
So, I mean, since you're here tonight, assuming everything completes on schedule, can we just say that you don't have to come back with an update unless it kind of extends into next year?
The process is actually that they are supposed to come back, so I don't know that we can bypass that process.
Well, maybe not have it, I don't know if we have the idea of a consent item of policy and service. I'm just saying that most of these things look like they'll be resolved in about 6 months or less.
That might be an option for my office to come back to council with an ordinance amendment for the city auditor's ordinance on how we handle these.
Yeah,
That
it's
they
just,
could be.
I don't know if we need to change the process or just keep it short at policy and services, if it's going to come
We
back
tend
so
to,
fast.
we tend to.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and move the staff motion. It's nice to see these things completed and in progress. So, thank you. I don't have any other comments.
Thank you. No, thank you for this. I also agree. Seems to be a lot of progress, and as Tom mentioned, most of these finish up by the end of this year. My only question was on recommendation 2.2, and please forgive me if I'm just not up to speed on this. So HR reviewed the 22 claims that account for 87% of the total additional city benefits. How much financial risk is there involved in those? You may not have the information across those 22 claims. I'm just wondering what kind of dollar amounts we're talking about.
I have the audit report here, so we can look it up. Which one? Let's see.
2.2.
Yeah, it's recommendation 2.2. It's referring to Exhibit 11. So it would be this $569,902.
Sorry?
$569,902 was the amount to be reviewed.
And that could go either way, right? Some of that money. Those could be reaffirmed, or we might ask for some of those back. I was just noticing the 22 claims and action on the errors.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I was just interested in that. Any other comments? Councilmember Holman? With that, I think we'll put it to a quick vote. So the motion is to accept the staff report. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you very much. Thank you. And that passed unanimously. Thank you. Item number 3 is our tri-annual external quality control review of the Office of the City Auditor, the audit of the City Auditor.
Yes.
Harriet, if you have a staff report.
Yes, thank you. So the government auditing standards actually require us to undergo an external quality control review, which is often called a peer review, commonly also referred to as the audit of the auditors. And the purpose of the peer review is to ensure that we are following the government auditing standards in the work that we do, and that we have procedures established to help us to ensure that we will follow those standards. So the reviewers have to be independent from our organization, and so we had 2 reviewers from other audit offices. We don't select them. They are actually, we coordinate with the Association of Local Government Auditors and their peer review program, and they have a committee which has coordinators that have identified people throughout the country who have gone through the peer review training and have enough experience to be able to support doing a peer review. So we had 2, one from the city and county of Denver, Colorado, and the other peer reviewer was from Raleigh, North Carolina. So there are 3 levels of ratings. The highest is a pass, which means that our system of quality control is designed to provide assurance that we will comply with the standards and that we have complied with the standards. And we achieved the pass rating, which is the goal every year. They did have one management letter comment, and that was, it was actually something that we had already fixed, but I think because they had identified that I had identified it during my audit reviews, in 2 audits, that they went ahead and made a comment on it, just to, as a little reminder, and make sure that we follow that standard, and we have. As I said, I've updated our procedures and some templates to ensure that it's complied with, and that's when we get what we refer to as testimonial evidence, meaning we interviewed someone and they told us something, that we don't just take it verbatim for what they say, that we have some means of validating that that is a reliable statement, either through supporting documentation or that they're a recognized expert in their field, or some recognized way of saying that is a reliable way of saying that information can be supported in our audit. So other than that, that was the only comment, and our pass rating is what we hoped to achieve and did. So that's all I have on that.
Great, thank you very much, and congratulations on passing. This is again that we review and recommend to the City Council acceptance of this review. Comments, questions? Councilmember Wolbach.
I'll move acceptance.
Okay, would like to speak to it?
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Karen?
Congratulations, and this is every 3 years. Correct. And remind me how long you've been here? 4. 4. Oh, almost 4. April will be 4. So this is great, so it's all in your span of control? Correct. And so, congratulations, good job. Thank you. Job well done. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I mean, yeah, congratulations. This is a nice, totally clean report. It's nice to see. As you respond, I'm glad we responded to that one comment, before the report was finalized. And as far as I understood it, it was pretty much just don't use testimony alone.
Correct.
So, anyways. I have no other comments. Anything else, anyone? All right. Shall we vote? All in favor? Aye. Aye. That passes unanimously. Congratulations. Thank you. And we've got one more. The Auditor's Office Quarterly Report as of December 31st, 2017.
Thank you. So we do these every quarter. For the past quarter, we usually come back. It's usually about 6 weeks after the quarter, not the month right after, just because of the timing of the agenda planning process. So this is for October through December. Couple of highlights. We coordinated with the external financial auditor to release and present the city's financial statement audits in November 2017. We coordinated with the Department of Human Resources to develop a flyer and a business card to begin advertising the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline and the Employee Advice Line and the difference between them. There's a copy of that attached, but I also brought some of the cards so you can see on one side it says Auditor's Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline, and it shows what's on it and when you would call that, and the other side is Human Resources Advice Line, and these were passed out to the various departments. So, and you have a copy of it attached to here. To the report. And then there's also a flyer. There's a copy of this attached. And this is in all the city departments now, and they're going to make a few posters to post around city facilities. So this is sort of the first step of getting better information out there about what the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline is for, and also to advertise what HR has available for other advice that doesn't fit within the purview of the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline. We will also be working with HR to develop some guidance to present at the new employee orientation. And there's a copy of the flyer if you want the big one. And then, as I just said, we also underwent our triennial peer review and received a fully passed rating. So some of the things that we have in progress, We've been doing some work on enterprise resource planning, on the enterprise resource planning projects. One of the projects has been what we call a non-audit service, where one of our staff auditors is sitting in on the strategic and tactical team meetings, and listening to hear, it's sort of, this is a preventive project that we're undertaking, so that if we see things that seem like they might get the project off track, that we're providing advice to the department to help keep it on track before it gets too far out of alignment with the schedule. And then we're doing some audits that are looking at data to ensure that the data going into the new ERP system is not garbage coming out of the old ERP system. So we've got a data reliability and integrity audit that is looking at specific data sets. We also have a data and system governance audit that we're doing to really look at how are roles and responsibilities defined and assigned and defined to ensure that everyone who's involved in the process understands what their role is. And there's different roles depending if you're a part of IT or whether you're in the department. IT typically implements the system, but the departments are the data owners and the process owners. And so there's currently not any well-defined rules around that, and so this audit is going to be making recommendations on that. That audit is in the report writing phase now, and we should complete that before the end of the fiscal year. On the data reliability and integrity audit, we're currently looking at some HR payroll data. We'll be looking at other data sets. This kind of falls in line as an example, the procure-to-pay audit that we did last year, where we identified that there were a lot of weaknesses in the vendor master file that the city uses, and it resulted in the Administrative Services Department realizing that they need to clean up that data file before they transfer data over to the new ERP system. So this will be similar to that, and we'll be doing a variety of data sets as the city prepares to migrate data over to the new ERP system. We're also looking at an audit called separation of duties, and this audit is really looking at how duties are separated among different individuals to ensure that no one person does two tasks that could allow them to misappropriate city resources. For example, give themselves a pay raise and no one else would identify it, so that you separate duties in a different among different staff to ensure that there's a checks and balances in the system. So we're looking at providing sort of different tiers of what should be recommended, and then what controls you would need in place if you can't achieve the optimum due to staffing and other resource limitations. And we expect to have that. That is also in the report writing phase, so we will have that complete before the end of the fiscal year. We're working on a code enforcement audit, and we are, as part of that process, we also did a custom citizen survey, which I presented the results of at the council annual retreat, and that was to sort of gather opinions to help inform how we might make our recommendations, but we are looking at city data to actually support what the audit findings will be. We're looking at the processes, the policies and practices that the city uses around its code enforcement practices. We are wrapping up field work, and we'll start writing that report shortly, and that one we also expect to be done by the end of the fiscal year. I already discussed the ERP non-audit survey and the custom citizen survey. We finished up the National Citizen Survey, the annual performance report, and citizen-centric report, and presented those at the council retreat, so I won't go into detail about those. And then every quarter, throughout the year, we and a consultant that we have, Muni Services, look through different tax records, sales tax records, to identify businesses that may have potentially underreported or misallocated their sales tax to other jurisdictions, and then send information to the state. They just changed their name. They were the State Board of Equalization, but they just changed the tax. I can't remember the exact name. CFTDA, but I can't remember what that stands for. So, but they then actually do the audit and look through the sales records and consult with the taxpayer to determine if there is some revenue due to Palo Alto and arrange to get that properly remitted to us. So in the first quarter, or in the second quarter of FY18, our office identified $232,000 that was recovered, and the Muni Services recovered $21,000 for a total of $253,000 collected for the quarter, and almost $272,000 collected fiscal year to date. There are some delays. This number did recently go down. There are some delays in processing at the state, and so they have 34 misallocations waiting to be researched and processed. 11 of those are from our office inquiries, and 23 are from the Muni Service inquiries. And then when we do our June quarterly report, we will report the sales tax information from the Stanford Hospital project, that we have a special agreement to ensure that the city gets the sales tax that is incurred in that project. And then status of audit recommendations. So we have 12 audits that have open audit recommendations. They're all listed here with a summary of the recommendations that are open. 60 recommendations are open right now. 4 of those will actually be closed out in this coming quarter, or they were closed out in the coming quarter, but we didn't actually, or in this past quarter, but we didn't actually close the recommendations themselves in that quarter. They were closed the quarter before, and we just gave an update in the last quarter. So those were the inventory management, utility meter, procurement, inventory, and retirement, and the community services department fee schedules and parking funds. We have 3 of the outstanding status reports scheduled for the March Policy and Services Committee. That's the cash handling and travel expense audit, the cable franchise fees and PEG fees audit, and the continuous monitoring of payments audit. And then you heard one of those tonight. That was one of the ones that was past due, the disability rates and workers' compensation. So I do have a meeting scheduled with the city manager's office tomorrow to get our process set up more consistently. The city manager's office is there, the departments are responsible for reporting on the status, but when there was a shift in staffing in the city manager's office, it was kind of like who's doing what. So we're going to work on that process and get something a little bit more structured to ensure that these are coming to you on a more routine basis as they're supposed to. And then on page 55 of your packet, there's a graph that shows the breakdown of the aging of the recommendations and how many have been implemented each quarter. And then, as you know, our office operates the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Hotline. We have not had any complaints called into the hotline this fiscal year, and all of the ones from prior fiscal years are closed out. So that completes my report, and I will answer any questions.
Thank you very much. So we're being recommended to recommend this to our colleagues on council. Questions, comments, motions? Councilmember Walbach.
Just one question, and I apologize if we'd covered this previously. On packet page 52, the one on Community Services Department, the first bullet point there says revise city's cost recovery policy to align with relevant laws and reconfigure the Questica budget system to support fees that recover more than 100% of costs.
Yes.
Is it possible to provide a little bit more explanation of what that one was about?
Sure. So, Community Services Department had a cost recovery policy, and subsequent to that, the city developed a cost recovery policy, and the two didn't align completely. And so our recommendation was for Community Services now to bring theirs in alignment with the city, look at what the city policy was and how to make the two match.
So the relevant laws are city laws. This isn't.
It's a policy. It's
Right.
not really a law. It's
Okay,
a policy.
so this wasn't, as we've seen with other issues where there's been state legislation that we're trying to scramble to realign with. This is just making sure that our city policies are consistent with each other?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yes. And then so there was a misunderstanding that we could not recover more than 100% of costs for any types of services. And then as we did the audit, we learned that there are some types of services that Community Services provides that you can charge market rate, for example, rental of facilities. And so our Questica system was designed where it wouldn't let you recover more than that rate. So now we ask that they modify that to be able to accept a higher rate.
Okay, so as much as I continue to have some concerns and questions about whether we're always pursuing the right policy choices when it comes to cost recovery or even going beyond cost recovery, including for facilities rentals. I don't think that the auditor's report's the time to tackle those, but I appreciate providing that clarity. With that, I'd be happy to move the staff recommendation.
Thank you. Councilmember Du Bois, I'm assuming you've spoken.
I think this is a great report, and I appreciate, it sounds like the city manager's office is working to provide, continuing and improved collaboration and structure so that these can continue to move forward effectively and in a timely fashion to the committee. So thank you to the city manager's office and also to the city auditor.
Thank you.
Councilmember Du Bois.
Yeah, I have a couple of quick questions. I think I brought this up before. On the sales tax section, you provide a link to the quarterly reports, but the website's usually really far behind. It's about a year behind.
It's about 6 months behind, and that's the nature of the way the sales tax information comes in.
Well, the last report is March 2017.
Right, we have one pending to go in right now for the last quarter, and that's the most recent one that we have, so
So
that,
that'll be summer of 2017?
yes.
Okay. Why is it always that far behind?
It's the way the sales tax information gets reported, and the state has to compile it. The Muni Services does a report for us, and that's what we put into our website. So we are actually, if you'll recall, at a previous meeting, Liz Niss asked if we would have the consultant come and do a presentation. And so we tentatively are scheduling, I have a question into him to see if the date works. We're tentatively working on March 26th as a study session date for him to explain that sales tax report. It's a sales tax economic trends report, and so I think that will be a good time to.
Yeah, I made that a note for tentative agenda. That's going to go right to council, though, not to P&S. Is that the idea?
It will be a study session for all of council.
Okay, great. And the other question was just a couple of these older reports. So are these counts pretty up to date, I guess, of what's open?
Yes, we track them in a spreadsheet, and as they clear off, that we update the numbers.
But like the disability one, a bunch of those were closed, right?
Tonight, they were closed, but this is report as of December 31st, and we didn't have those numbers as of December 31st.
So the green purchasing practices one?
Yes.
That seems like one that everybody should rally around. Is there a reason, do you know why none of those have been implemented?
Well, it's just now coming due for its first report, and I know that the Zero Waste team is working on a response for that already, because they've already reached out to us. So I don't know, I haven't seen their responses, but I know that they're working on them.
So the number here, they could have implemented them, just it's not up.
We don't have information to show what they've implemented. Yes.
And the other one is is the water meter billing report.
Yes.
I guess we're not going to get update for a while on that one.
That one's not
That was the one
due.
where we had like potential refunds too.
Correct.
So again, do you know or that some of those have been addressed?
I don't. We typically don't get information. The departments typically don't update us on an ongoing basis. Not until we get those reports to verify the status do we typically know what's going on. Sometimes they will reach out to us as they're implementing just to say, is this really what you meant? But for the most part, we don't know the status until we get those reports.
Okay. And what are the due dates that you're putting down?
So those, when we submit, excuse me, when we submit the report to to Policy and Services, and then they submit it to, they make the recommendation to council, there's usually a lag of about 5 or 6 weeks before the minutes are ready, and we can get that to council as a consent item. Once council approves as a consent item, that's when we start counting. 6 months from that date is when we say it's due, and then every 6 months thereafter.
Okay, so nothing is technically past due, though some have had several due dates, right?
Correct. Right. If the only one that was really past due was the disability rates and workers' compensation, which you heard tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Holman?
Yes, thank you. I want to especially thank you for something that you'll recall I pushed for some time ago, was your involvement in the SAP ERP transition. So thank you for doing that. And I know it involves talking with an awful lot of people. And one question I have about it, which will have to do with future audits, is there cross-training, especially that we have some senior staff that are going to be retiring? Is there cross-training that's going on, or?
So some of that are questions we've raised in the non-audit service memos to the department. At this point, they have not identified all the staff that would be involved in the design and implementation team. Typically, what you do is you bring the staff who are doing the work and most familiar with it onto the design and implementation team, and then you backfill for them temporarily for people to do the day-to-day work. And I do know that a lot of the people that would be involved in that are people who could come due to retire during the period of time that implementation would take, because the final implementation isn't expected to be, they'll be phased, and it's not expected to be fully complete until 2022. And so there's a lot of years in between where a lot of people could retire, and I don't know what the plan is for that at this point.
It seems like it's something that, from my perspective, and I'm not the pro in this situation, but it seems like it's something that you might be the auditor, as the auditor, be involved in developing a plan that's a transition plan having to do with accountability and efficiency and efficacy of the new ERP. So, just a thought.
We can think about that as we do the new audit plan for next year.
It'd be good. Inventory management. I mean, this goes back so far that I was on Policy and Services. So it goes back to 2014.
Yes.
And the recommendations that are open seem to be very basic. I mean, at the core of, and I don't have it in front of me, of course, what the ones are that have been closed, but the ones that are still open seem to be very, very basic to inventory management procedures. So what's the holdup?
The holdup has to do with inventory that belongs to utilities and all the different locations where they have that inventory, and the ability to track that inventory. Some of it was what they call non-valued inventory, which are things that are, they typically would take out and load up into their trucks for use on jobs, like nuts and bolts and things that they don't want to typically count every single one, or large items that don't go in the warehouse, and trying to get the utilities to be able to figure out how they can comply with the policy with the way their operations work.
So to my ear, that sounds like how you deal with the inventory that currently is on hand.
Yes.
But these open recommendations have to do with, implementing policies and update and enforce inventory count policies and.
So I can tell you that Administrative Services has written some policies and procedures, and it's the utility side that they feel those policies and procedures don't particularly work for their type of inventory. And so it's really the utility side of things that is slowing down the implementation of the rest of these recommendations.
Do they have any, you said that it's due 5/18, so is that realistic?
I don't know. It's been a long time. If you notice, the first report wasn't until 3 years after, and a lot of that was trying to work with the utilities piece of it. So I don't know if that's actually realistic. The due date is really the date for the next status report, and not necessarily a date that means that they're going to have the recommendations all implemented.
But I hope that would be a target date for implementation.
Yeah, I'd have to go
For the
back.
departments, I mean.
I'd have to go back and look at the previous status report, the one from November, which I don't have with me, to see when they said those last 4 recommendations would be implemented.
So again, my comment, just to reiterate, my comment is that these look like policy things that are pretty key and central to satisfaction of the recommendations. And perhaps in the future, when you're doing this, that you might highlight what's been accomplished and what hasn't. If there's one department that's not performing but the others have, I think it's important for those looking at this report to understand where the open recommendations are residing. With the green purchasing, and part of this might involve the city clerk's office. Green purchasing is something I think that, well, it's too bad that none of these have been, of the 8 recommendations, 8 of them are open. And one of them that I appreciate tonight, we have this water, and just a suggestion, not a, but I've been thinking also, because we got called out a few weeks ago, and I think appropriately so, about our bottled water use.
Yes.
And go to city, and I know that was in your audit when you did
Yes.
it some time back. And those of us who, oops, those of us who like carbonated water, I mean, it's a simple little thing, but there are countertop things that carbonate water. So maybe we could switch to that instead of buying. Yeah, so just a thought. So I look forward to more of this being addressed. This is pretty, I think it's a bit of an embarrassment, actually.
When I heard the auditor say, though, Councilmember Holman, is that, say if you take the green purchasing practices, because the report hasn't gone to the auditor yet, means that we just don't know if these have been implemented yet. Several of them may have been. I'm sure the staff have been working on them. So I think we can help here by the city manager's office and me being more aware of where we are in the process of implementing these before the status report, to give you a little more information on where these things are at.
Okay, that would be helpful and appreciated. Okay, I think those are my comments, and thank you very much.
Okay.
So thank you for the report, very helpful. Totally want to concur with Councilmember DuBois about the sales and use tax allocation. I was surprised at the amount of money there. So thank you for doing that. My only, I guess, question or comment is it would be helpful to see where the recommendations are most stale, right? Whether it's by different department or how long they've been sitting around. Even like a burn down chart, how many we're adding per year, how many we're taking off, just so we get a bit of a comprehensive view rather than just looking through and saying, oh, this one's 0 for 8.
I do have a little comment on, it's page 50, packet page 50. It says 60 were open at the beginning of the year, of the quarter, and none were closed.
Okay.
I do update that each quarter, and then I put the little graph in the back. So you're thinking maybe something by department.
I think that'd be a nice way to look at it. And the only other thing, and this is just another comment, if there are recommendations that have gone stale or kind of obsolete, just indicating that to us. I don't know if there are any in this report, but maybe going forward in the future if some of them fall off.
So one of the things when I came on board, there were a lot of very old recommendations, and we've made a big push over the last couple of years to get through some of those. I have worked particularly with the Administrative Services Department, but I've also made it clear to the city manager's office that if some of these recommendations that are old seem like they're not feasible anymore, to come talk to me, because if they're not feasible, I'm not going to hold them open. And we actually did close 2 of those 14 recommendations in the inventory management audit. When we closed out 10 of those, 2 of those were because they no longer made sense.
Okay, thank you.
The one other comment, when we are doing audits now, if there is something that we're finding that is really about the way SAP is configured, I am telling my staff not to tell the departments to fix SAP. We're on the path for a new ERP system, and it doesn't make sense to me to pull resources from that big project to fix a system that's going away. So we will have a series of recommendations that say as SAP or as the new ERP system is implemented, and you will see some delay in being able to implement those recommendations because they'll be totally tied to the timing of the ERP system.
That makes sense. Thank you. Any other comments or questions, or should we vote on this? Great, so the motion is to recommend approval or recommendation of this report. All in favor? Aye. That passes unanimously. Thank you very much. That's our last item. Future meetings and agendas. Our next meeting is Tuesday, March 13th, and I'll be meeting with Rob to kind of flesh out some of the ones over the next couple months and weeks.
I have some ideas.
You want to share? Sure.
So thanks for reminding me about the sales tax one, because I think that'll be an interesting one. I wondered if maybe sometime relatively soon we could get just an ERP replacement update. I think that'd be useful. I'm interested in.
So I think finance might be asking for that also, so it might make sense then to do it as a study session for all of council rather than at each committee.
Yeah. If it fits on the agendas, if not, maybe the same thing could be done with both subcommittees.
Yeah, typically, I know typically we don't do that,
Yeah.
so it would make sense if you're going to do that, to do it as a
Yeah.
council.
Okay. I think it impacts a lot of our audits, and I think there are a lot of issues just waiting for that. And I'd be interested in a kind of a senior programs review or just update at some point. Corey's probably going to say this, but I'd love this to have us discuss the town hall plan and topics for the year.
Yeah.
And then if you guys are interested, maybe we could ask council to review the fiber to the premises plan, just get an update on that. And then I think one we've done before is Track Watch. I'm really not sure what the status of that is. So those are just ones that came to mind.
Thank you. Any other suggestions? Councilmember Walbach.
Yeah, I'll also say that I think we should probably bring the town hall program back to policy and services for kind of an update, reevaluation, for a chance to make new recommendations or renewed recommendations to council and to staff for how to reinvigorate and revitalize that program. Yeah, and also I would also share Councilmember Du Bois's interest in kind of a look at senior programs. And actually one other that I would add, whether it's here or at council, but maybe this would be a good year, given the renewed focus of this committee on housing, to have a discussion about homeless services and policies. I know there's some discussion. Councilmember Du Bois and Holman both brought it up last night, and maybe this committee is a good place to have that conversation this year. So.
I had 2, and Corey just touched on one of them, which was the committee can't initiate a program, but I think it would be good if we could at least review what the prior safe parking program and recommendations were. Is that what you were intending, Councilmember Wilbach?
Actually, I wanted to start kind of at a broader level, but I could envision that certainly being a potential component. I want to kind of start with an overview of homeless services available in Palo Alto, whether provided by the city or partners, just kind of get us up to speed, and then talk also about where we want to supplement or change.
I could agree with that, and then also add to that, bring to us what the prior safe parking recommendations were. And if you could bring with you also, not just what the services are, but what our homeless population is and how it's trended over the last, say, I want to say 10 years, but certainly since 9/11, since that period in time. And also, I imagine, we've had a few economic downturns, and there was one about 2001, and there's one like 2008, and, 2011 seemed to have some impact, but maybe not as much as some of the others. So, so probably 10 years is good. Probably 10 years is good. And also what the vulnerable populations are in Palo Alto. Tom mentioned, seniors, but what's the, I just heard something, and I haven't verified it, but I just heard something yesterday, I guess it was, that the population in Palo Alto that's living below the poverty line is something like 20%. So I don't know if you have any information that you can gather around that. I mean, the census is pretty dated at this point, but, and that's all kind of associated with this, what Councilmember Wilbach brought up. Then the other thing is, when in our schedule will we be looking at, which is a requirement in our code, that when would we be looking at the policy and services procedures and protocols? We have to do an annual review. And that should be done early enough in the year that we can get it to the council. And we might have some back and forth on that, so that needs to be scheduled.
Okay, I'll look at that.
Okay.
And I know there's going to be additional housing items coming after your discussion about the work plan. I think a number of items were referred to policy and services, so we'll look to add those.
All right, thank you all for the feedback and contributions.
Chair, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I did have one other one, which is number 3 here is community health needs assessment. And there's a community needs assessment that for Cubberley that was, I believe, recommended by, and I know we're meeting with the joint, with the school, and I think the school board recommended to do the community needs assessment, and Parks and Rec did, and the CAC for Cubberley recommended doing it. So this looks like this is something different.
Yeah, this is something different. This is coming from the fire department, and it's more about critical health needs assessment as opposed to just a general needs assessment. What I can say is with the Cubberley piece, with the RFP, and we'll talk about this on Thursday at the city school meeting, but that includes a needs assessment as part of that program.
Good, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Jessica, you had a comment.
Yes, thank you. Chair Fine, because this is the first meeting of the committee, this is also an opportunity if you would like to discuss start time for the committee moving forward this year. I know we like to set that for the calendar. Right now, the code stipulates that we start at 7, but we've also started at 6 and other times, so this is a good opportunity.
What's good for you all?
We've been starting at 6 for the last several years.
Yeah, it's better for staff.
Do you want to change to 6? Okay, let's do 6.
Okay, we'll move forward with a 6 p.m. start time.
Thank you. If we need exceptions, just...
No, we'll just move forward with the schedule.
And if more, if we can't get a quorum at 6 p.m., just email me and let me know. We'll try to move. We can move to 7 if we need to.
One other question. So I've noticed the last couple of years sometimes that, well, a few years ago, we moved a lot of responsibility, tried to balance things between finance and policy and services. But I noticed last year and the year before, but especially last year, that policy and services didn't meet very often. And the intention was, prior to, I think, probably anybody here being on council besides me, was to try to balance out the workload so that policy and services would probably be meeting twice a month. You just looking at the list of things that we've added, the thing that you just added about housing and these, I don't see how we're going to be meeting once a month and accomplish all of those goals.
Yeah.
So what's the staff thinking on that?
We'll work with the chair.
We'll talk it out and
Yeah.
try to prioritize these and see if we need to meet twice a month. Or if it's every other month, we do it twice. But I take that under advisement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and as far as policy and services having a meeting or two canceled last year, I'll just encourage colleagues to make sure you make the meetings. There were a couple times where we couldn't make quorum because of scheduling conflicts among committee members.
It wasn't a criticism. It was not a criticism. It was just an observation.
Well, our next meeting will be March 13th at 6 p.m. Thank you all so much. This meeting is adjourned. It is 9:30.